All right, everybody. Welcome to the 8th and final seminar of the René Girard course taught by Geoff Shullenberger. This is what we call the Proseminar for all of the courses that we do within the indiethinkers.org system. We do the final seminar as a public panel discussion. So what we're going to do for the next hour or two is we are going to hear from a series of people who were in the 8-week seminar for the past 8 weeks, people who have been reading and studying René Girard closely for the past 8 weeks as a group. Everyone here has come to some kind of interesting idea or hypothesis or insight that we've really urged all the participants to crystallize and condense for a public audience. So what we're going to do is we're going to go around the room just like a kind of like an academic conference. Basically, it'll be a panel style discussion where we have 9 people presenting theses or short papers on various aspects of René Girard. So we're going to ask participants to speak for just about 5 minutes max. So this should be a fast-paced, highly stimulating and fun discussion to watch or listen to. All right. So between each 5-minute talk, there will be some time for comments or questions. So there should be a nice balance, a nice combination of organized, prepared insights and ideas and hypotheses and some free discussion as well. And then at the very end, Geoff Shullenberger, who's here with us today, who's been facilitating the course, and I will kind of play what in the academic world you'd call discussant. We'll be listening closely to all of the talks, and then we will give some closing remarks. I don't make any claim to be a Girard scholar, but I've read a few Girard books, and I have not been a part of the course. I'm just running these courses, but I'll kind of play the role of a relatively uneducated bystander, and so my input might be interesting and revealing precisely for that reason. I'm really excited to hear what this group has been working on. I'm really excited to learn about the collective ethos that has emerged over the past 8 weeks of intensive study in this seminar. We have some really, really bright people in this group. So yeah, I'm just really excited to be here today, really excited to kick this off. And I'm just super curious and interested to learn about what everyone's been working on. Before we get started, Dr. Shullenberger, would you like to say anything? No pressure or no expectation, but just wanted to let you say a few words if you wanted to.
Just briefly, it's been a extremely illuminating course for me because I've gotten perspectives from people with a wide variety of backgrounds and sort of angles on Girard and sort of paths towards him in terms of how they got interested in him. So I definitely was also learning a great deal from the participants in the course. So I look forward to hearing their further insights today because I've definitely gotten a lot of new things to think about in relation to Girard from the past 8 weeks. So.
All right. Thank you for that, Geoff. And thank you for facilitating the seminar series. I've only heard really good things. So yeah, we're really glad to have you on board doing this course. So, all right, then I think without further ado, we will get right into it. And the final thing I want to say to anyone out there watching or listening is that all of the participants will be putting in the show notes, whether you're listening to this on YouTube or what have you, we'll put in the show notes links or extra information to each of the panelists, whatever they feel like sharing. So a lot of people here are, working on blogs or Substacks or podcasts or what have you. So if you want to learn more about any of the speakers, or if you're interested in anything you hear, just check the show notes and we'll have some more information on everyone there. Of course, some people might want to remain a little mysterious, which is fine too. All right. So going in no particular order, I'd like to introduce Sasha Klein. Sasha would like to speak briefly about Girard's rejection of the romantic lie and discuss some of the other key ideas in Girard that he found most interesting. So please, Sasha, take it away.
Cool. Okay. So first, I wanted to start with a brief apology to Justin. When I've tried timing this has been slightly longer than 5 minutes. I'll try to read quickly. Also, a thank you to Justin and Geoff and the whole course. This has been excellent. Just super fascinating, mind-changing, and enjoyable experience. And I'll actually be talking about Girard on differentiation and undifferentiation, which was a concept I wanted to work through and compare. So getting started on that. I'd like to start with a quote from the 17th century monk Francisco de Santa Maria, which is included in Girard's 1989 book, The Scapegoat, and describing society during the onset of the plague. Quote, "As soon as this violent and tempestuous spark is lit in the kingdom or republic, magistrates are bewildered, people are terrified, the government thrown into disarray. Laws are no longer obeyed, business comes to a halt, families lose coherence, and the streets their lively atmosphere. Everything is reduced to extreme confusion. Everything goes to ruin. For everything is touched and overwhelmed by the weight and magnitude of such a horrible calamity. People, regardless of position or wealth, are drowning in mortal sadness. All the laws of love and their nature are drowned or forgotten in the midst of the horrors of such great confusion. Children are suddenly separated from their parents, wives from their husbands, brothers and friends from each other. Men lose their natural courage and, not knowing any longer what advice to follow, act like desperate blind men who encounter fear and contradictions at every step." This, for Girard, is the evocative context of what he termed a sacrificial crisis, a calamity, generally external in origin, but almost instantaneously social in nature, befalls a community. The social nature of the crisis becomes dominant as it disintegrates family structures, destroys hierarchical relationships, and plunges the community into abject chaos. Girard referred to this implosion of social structure as a loss of differentiation, and one of his key insights was that this mounting undifferentiation was at once effect and cause of the crisis. The contagion is both biological and social, and the social aspect comes to predominate. The true chaos, which requires the most urgent remedy, is not the plague itself, but the precipitous loss of social structure and cohesion. For this reason, perhaps, human societies thrown into such undifferentiated chaos developed what Girard termed the scapegoating mechanism, identifying and punishing a social cause of the phenomena, usually some marginal individual or group whose perceived moral failings relate to the abrogation of rules of social differentiation. This inherently different scapegoat is expelled or murdered. The process reintroduces unity and over time creates rituals of sacrifice which form the foundation of new institutions and social order. The predominantly social sacrificial crisis is resolved. Girard explores the myth of Oedipus to exemplify this phenomenon. The myth of Oedipus, sorry. A social outsider, a prototypical scapegoat with a limp, Oedipus introduces a crisis, again a plague, by violating the bounds of familial differentiation. He kills his father and sleeps with his mother. This moral pollution causes the crisis, which only a self-sacrificial blinding and exile can resolve. As Girard explores in depth, many ancient societies built rituals around such myths, involving the strict avoidance of anything undifferentiated. Twins or close brothers, for notable example. Note the mythic recurrence of fraternal murder, say Cain of Abel or Romulus of Remus, which serves as the explicit foundation for a post-crisis culture. These rituals and the institutions built upon them aim to instill and maintain differentiation, hierarchy, social structure, rules, and boundaries, based upon the intuition that the loss of such differentiation both results from and causes, in fact, defines the societal crisis and collapse itself. In this light, it's both interesting and unsettling to witness what feels to me to be a modern crisis of undifferentiation, a societal confusion around boundaries, rules, hierarchies, and definitions. We generally conceive of America as a highly civilized and stable society with clear political and often social hierarchies and systems of justice. But this thin veneer of differentiation, perhaps another term for stable social structure and civilization itself, seems increasingly thin. Trust in shared institutions is dissolving in the acid of political discord. A nearly universal loss of faith in institutions of social order typifies this dissolution. On one side, Black Lives Matter, a largely leftist movement, advances an underlying thesis that was once called our criminal justice system, idealized as external and above factional conflict, is in fact a largely race-motivated entity, divorced from any attempted equal application of the law, more threat than defender. A separate movement on the right, and once on the left, increasingly sees our federal intelligence institutions as similar threats to, rather than defenders of, the people they are meant to serve. Society loses faith that our institutions are not, in fact, their opposites. Simultaneously, our most traditional social norms and boundaries are eroding. Cultural institutions of nearly all scales seem in decline. Marriage, once a core societal institution, continues its decline as divorce rates march higher and out-of-wedlock birth rates continue their unabated climb. Modern work and educational demands incentivize early and consistent geographic transplantation, prying the young from their parents and the places they were born, causing families to, quote, lose coherence, as in Santa Maria's account. Within at least my own social circle, to live near where one is born or where one was 5 years ago, embedded within a strong and hierarchical family or social structure, is a mark of narrow parochialism. Sex, a biological distinction once held to be foundational to most human societies and certainly our own, is increasingly characterized as a social confabulation, a thing without clear boundary to be adopted or discarded at will. The basic boundaries of our society, which define its membership, have also become increasingly muddy, as political debates frequently conflate legal and illegal immigration, and legislative changes obscure which rights or services are due to citizens or non-citizens. In the height of the concern following the January 6th Capitol riots, we now see our institutions of power, along with our core institutions of information, characterizing a large swath of the country, perhaps a majority of one half of the populace, as if not terrorists, then terrorism adjacent. Similarly, following 2016, it was common among major news outlets to assert that our leader was in effect the agent of a rival country. Amidst all this, it is hard to know what constitutes a shared sense of society and its membership. You may land on one side or another of any of these debates, but their general trend seems towards a breakdown of once shared social boundaries, institutions, and norms, a rise in undifferentiation. As today's plague continues to rage, this undifferentiation has crescendoed and now seeps into and undermines our shared epistemological processes. A furious debate raises about who is a scientist and who's pseudoscientist, what is information and what misinformation. As our government seeks to stop such misinformation, it more and more explicitly effaces the boundary between itself and our private institutions of information. Knowledge itself is increasingly balkanized, consequently degrading our ability to communicate and find consensus. We are a modern Tower of Babel. Quote, everything is reduced to extreme confusion. I'm near the end, Justin. COVID has cost many lives, but it seems to me that this last year's crisis is, like Santa Maria's, predominantly a crisis of social cohesion, chiefly characterized by a breakdown in our capacity for communal action, communal sense-making, or shared community at all. In turn, this social crisis fuels the biological crisis, hampering our ability to arrive at an effective and acceptable response. Note, as in primitive myth, the uncertainty regarding the underlying cause of the plague itself. Is it purely natural in origin, or is it human and moral in cause, like the plague of Thebes, the result perhaps of hubristic researchers crossing the boundaries between God and man? Is this virus Trump's fault for undifferentiating politics and celebrity, Fauci's for hubristically exceeding man's limitations, Cuomo's for wearing nipple rings? Wherever you stand on these many debates, it seems to me that we are entering an era of disappearing differentiation, where the lines which delineate society seem to be wearing thin. As in the quotation opening this essay, this wave of undifferentiation is lockstep with a crisis it at once follows and causes. In the myth Girard excavates, the crisis is generally resolved through the expulsion or collective murder of a scapegoat, a mechanism which he argues has been eroded through the Christian revelation. If this thesis is true, if undifferentiation presages societal crisis, and the mechanisms for its relief is now outside our grasp, we face an uncertain and chaotic future, with yet more great confusion lying ahead.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Sasha. I'd like to open it up to any questions, comments, or immediate responses. Anyone? We will have some time to circle back later also if anyone wants. You can put your hand up, or I guess you can just chime in. This group's not too unwieldy. Anyone? I mean, I might ask, just out of curiosity, just to kind of, that was an excellent and very thoughtful, prepared talk. Just kind of going off the cuff a little bit informally. I'm curious, Sasha, just from your personal perspective, where do you see it going? Like, do you see this getting worse, getting better? What's your sense of the temporal dynamics of what you describe?
I mean, I think I see some sort of continued balkanization. I feel like what strikes me as the greatest conflict is that you have, I mean, there was a Slate Star Codex piece about this years ago, the sort of physical co-location of people. I think you talked about it as like a dark matter universe of people whose whole worldview is so drastically different from your own. That appears to be accelerating. So from this like epistemological context where we're trying to figure out what the hell's going on and be able to communicate with one another about it, we have such different sources of information that this communication has become essentially impossible. And I sort of assume increasing fractionation made possible by largely, hopefully, the internet leading to some sort of peaceful coexistence, or the erosion, ideally over time, of whatever information sources are less quote unquote true. And I shouldn't put true in quotes because I believe it's a meaningful concept. Or alternately, a movement towards some sort of top-down control that like obviates the mimetic rivalry and crisis that Girard is concerned of, but in a more frightening and totalitarian manner. And I'm not sure which I consider more likely.
All right, well put. Thank you for that. Grant?
Sasha, how do you personally try, do you think that there's a role for the individual in helping to redifferentiate society, or how are you planning to, turn your belief into some form of action?
Oh, that's fun. No, I mean, here's a cop-out. I think it's typical in our modern day for most people to conceive of their role in affairs on a level of political. And I think that's kind of where my head is constantly trapped. And that is a source of great, stress, anxiety, and confusion, and probably not too much action. But I think, one of the things that very unrelated to this essay that has struck me in this class is the differentiation between internal and external modeling, or mediation. So this idea that you can like draw your desires and goals from people close to you, with whom you're in some degree of conflict, or from like a higher ideal, often religious in nature. And part of this for me is that one of my takeaways from the course is to try to really think about, to the extent I can, in an unmediated manner, what my ideals ought to be, model myself upon them, and model myself after that, and try to model my proximate community after a shared sense of ideals that are structure giving and don't sort of dissolve connection. Yeah. And build communities that are coherent. Yeah.
That's awesome. Great question, Grant. Thank you. And again, excellent answer, Sasha. Well put. Thanks for the really thoughtful talk, Sasha. Let's keep it going. Let's hear from some more people. We can circle back to any of these themes, and indeed we will at the end when everyone's talked. So, all right, great first talk to kick it off. So next up, let's hear from Grant Dever. Grant is actually the community director at indiethinkers.org. He is very interested in community. He is the author of a book called Lead the Future, and he's generally interested in organizations, leadership, memes, and social dynamics. So you can find out more about Grant at grantdever.com. He writes a Substack on community building. So Grant, please take it away. And
thank you.
Yeah, it's all you.
So a brief introduction of my assumptions, and then a Girardian analysis of Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry. So Friedrich Nietzsche lamented the death of God in the gay science in 1882. He feared the consequences of this paradigm shift in Christian societies before the outbreak of Europe's Great Wars. Reflecting on the two world wars and the rise of both communism and Nazism, Carl Jung published Gegenwart und Zukunft in 1958. The English translation is known as The Undiscovered Self. The main argument in this text is that in the absence of God, humans have a desire to worship, and in the absence of God, they will substitute God with ideology, or as I will call them, little gods. Quote, "You can take away a man's gods, but only if you give him others in return." Continuing my assumptions, both in Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott and The Inserto of Nassim Taleb, these authors have essentially shown that there is not only the risk for these modern ideologies or little gods to blow up in catastrophes like World War II or the mass starvation in Ukraine, but they have not and cannot deliver on their ambitious promises. In The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry, like Friedrich Nietzsche, he is grappling with the consequences of a metaphorical death. And I proclaim the little gods are dead. Gurry documents the rise of nihilism and politics of negation playing out due to the public's use of social media to organize and the transmission of communications which undermine trust in elites. He fears that these dynamics will result in the destruction of democracy and the associated institutions, while not providing any viable substitutes for society. The theories of René Girard can help to explain the dynamics which Gurry documents as accelerating our descent into nihilism. One, the structure of social media has created a great leveling and resulting undifferentiated chaos by making high status people legible and seemingly accessible to us. As a result, we view them as being our peer or even lesser, which has increased people's envy and impotent hatred for the elites who appear to be undeserving of their treasures and relative status. This crisis of undifferentiation is on full display on our Twitter feeds, as we've discussed at length. 2, our desire to mimic others who we perceive to be high status and avoid being sacrificed by the outgroup has led to people embracing new yet dead ideologies which have no clear positive vision of the future. Universities, newspapers, and Hollywood are all in decline as their market share is eaten by independent creators on the internet, including our own Geoff Shullenberger. The scarcity of good positions in sinking ship creates a zero-sum game for these individuals who end up in mimetic conflict. In turn, they create narratives which can turn one of their in-group members, say their boss, into an out-group sacrifice. The key example being the firing of the New York Times science reporter Donald McNeil for having used this slur on an educational trip in the context of discussing the slur itself to promote sensitivity. These dynamics have resulted in these institutions exporting their niche mimetic conflict throughout our country and even abroad via the associated and justifying ideology, in this case, a radical strain of anti-racism. The citizens' mimicry of these behaviors further erodes our cultural norms, spurs new sacrifices as people polarize around these issues, and leads to greater distrust in the politics of negation that Gurry is documenting. 3, and final point, the public demands the most from its government at the time when it is most aware of its inability to deliver on its promises. In the desire to avoid conflict, the public seeks scapegoats to dissipate the tension. Social media has increased legibility and made it easier for people to coordinate into in-groups and out-groups. You join an in-group by mimicking their behavior, and then you're rejected into an out-group by either violating those norms or otherwise failing to maintain group identity. The combination of a desire to scapegoat, the increased ease of forming new in-group and out-group identities, and through the Christian revelation, as Girard argues, the breaking of the scapegoat mechanism has fueled these politics of negation and increased demand for sacrifices.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Grant. Very thoughtful talk yet again. Would anyone like to chime in with a question, comment, anything at all? You can raise your digital hand, or you can also just chime in if you'd like. Sasha, please.
Sorry, unmuting. I've been wrestling with this question myself, and you essentially brought it up, but it strikes me in many ways that social media creates new avenues for scapegoating, and Girard has this underlying thesis that its efficacy is waning, but it also potentially seems more common to me right now. Do you have what's your intuition around that thesis of the waning power of scapegoating? Does it seem that way to you?
Yeah, I guess my sort of analysis is that and Girard has, I think he was already dealing with this, because he's that's how he ends up believing that it's broken. But essentially, he actually makes an explicit reference to the desire for a scapegoat being and the resulting like lack of catharsis that comes from use being similar to that of like an addict seeking their fix. And like as you develop this tolerance, you can't find it. You can't get that satisfaction. And I think that we are seeing it actually accelerate even more so because of the in-group, out-group dynamics sort of proliferating through social media and the internet more broadly. So that's kind of my take.
Excellent. Scott?
So do you view it as some apocalyptic thing, or do you think it's just going to lead to like mass change?
I'm not. So I'm a resident anti-doomer. I can't have the doomer take. I think that it's going to lead to change. I guess I'm not long on platform social media. I think if we were going to live in a society where we're going to have a 24/7 news cycle and like Twitter marathons like from now until the day I die, I would not be an optimist. But I actually don't think that that's going to be the case. So I think there are many problems, but that at least that specific niche I think will open up. I see radical social transformation and hopefully a good kind in my future.
Awesome. Exciting. And Grant did not use his full time, so that's good. We have a lot of time for questions and comments. Leif, please.
Great talk, Grant. Thank you so much. My question is about the religiosity that you talked about, that you mentioned. What is your I'm really fascinated by that, in part because of my own research and secularity and post-secularity. What is your feeling about that going forward? I mean, I can imagine a variety of responses. Some might, a new atheist type might say, well, we just need to finally move past the residue of the social forms of religion. And other people might say we need to reinvigorate the traditional form. Like, what do you, it sounds to me that, well, I'll just ask this. What's your kind of take as to what will happen, and maybe, conversely, what could happen that would be beneficial with that kind of abiding religious energy or religious urgency?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't really see. I think to some extent there may be a return to religion. Not at a large scale. I don't think we're going to have like a dominant Christian majority in the U.S. in perpetuity or something like that. And I don't think we would have a cascade that way. I think people may come to believe that some of these political ideologies are essentially these little gods, as I've deemed them. I think with Gurry, they're like, I agree with him. The risk of this like nihilism and politics of negation is pretty significant. My personal kind of solution or framework that I'm in favor of is increasingly localizing power and letting people organize themselves more so based off of their values. I think the centralization of these modernist states, kind of like with Scott and with Taleb and even Gurry himself, I don't think it's really working in the way that the ideologues thought it would. And I think that we need people that needs to not be a partisan idea, but like kind of a pragmatic takeaway. So we actually need a turn towards a kind of tolerance where we let live in probably broader ways.
Awesome. Thanks. Brenton?
I was gonna ask about because you said you weren't long on platform social media, but I don't see technology and social media going away. But I was thinking like social media as it's structured right now, where it's like we have this large spread of like pretty much like we're surpassing our Dunbar number. How do you think social media is going to go beyond that? Like how else do you think social media could exist? What other forms?
Yeah, I think so. I think one, there will be like probably self-segmentation, and like certain kinds of discourse will end up in like more private small group things, or even be kind of paywalled off from other things, which I'm not saying is good, but I think it like will happen, or it's good in some ways. It's but obviously inegalitarian in others. We already see this with like paywalled Substacks, kind of like taking over like the bit of there's a brief time where you could get all news articles online, and then that didn't really work. It's not a sustainable business model. And now we have sort of the paywalling of content. So I think that's like one way in which these things will kind of turn, is just stuff being more closed off. The other piece is I think adding like costly signaling. So I think some of the crypto solutions in the future may require you to pay to say something, or potentially punish you for not abiding by certain norms in like a network that you opt into, but like will otherwise be like fairly egalitarian. So again, I don't really know how these play out, but I think somehow making it so talk is not as cheap and memeing people is costly is probably part of it.
All right. Excellent. And final thought here from Kevin, please.
Yeah. Hey, great diagnosis, Grant. And I also appreciated what Sasha had to say. But what is the model for the community that you would like to build? I think that we're all kind of resigned to some form of mass exodus. Sasha mentioned a model based on ideals. What would yours be? Would it be a person? Would it be a series of ideals? And how would you prevent that from lapsing into an ideology? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly tough, right? So I think your point there is how do you make sure something doesn't become a cult as well, which is like probably like a mixture of a person and an ideology, and the creation of an ideology. So I don't know. There's a lot of failure modes for relocation and identifying based off of values. I think starting with values, probably connecting them to some kind of strong narrative tradition that is older, whether that is a Christianity or maybe some other religions that I'm not as well versed in. Not that I'm well versed in any religions, but I would say that the also start small, but start adjacent to other people. So I think I don't want the takeaway from my talk to be, okay, like we have to exit. Who wants to buy this land with me and we'll all move there? Because I think, like, I don't know what the stats are, but I think a good percentage of all those projects turn into sex cults. So if you don't want to join a sex cult, don't do that. Maybe move to Austin instead, get a job, and then like have some friends, and maybe you can like found a school or something in the future. I don't know, take it slow. These are long projects. They won't be solved in a decade.
Man, I'm disappointed. I was about to like buy into your land purchasing arrangement. I was sold until you said no sex cults. No, I'm just kidding. All right, awesome. So thank you, Grant, for an excellent talk, which inspired some really interesting and excellent questions. So we're really picking up steam now, folks. This is excellent. So next up, let's hear from Ryan. Ryan is an artist in NYC, and he's going to speak about René Girard's theory of the novel. Ryan Malady. Sorry, I should have checked with you first before on how you pronounce your last name. How do you say it?
Malady.
Excellent. Ryan Malady, please take it away.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about specifically my novel, my forthcoming novel, and then I'll do like a brief plot description, since I don't think anyone's read it besides Scott, and then I'll do a Girardian reading of the novel. So the novel opens with a scene of a disfigured toddler writhing around in a vague desert before being blown up by some kind of ammunition. The narrator sneezes onto his monitor, and we realize he's not in the desert. He's at work watching a video on his computer. It's his last day. He goes through his checklist of content moderation rules. He's interested in the videos and the people posting them. He thinks they're often funny. The creators, the nihilists, the pervs, the political extremists that produce the borderline content that he moderates for his employer. He mimics their jokes to coworkers. The narrator is also a contemporary artist, a recent MFA grad. He quits the content moderation gig to move back in with his parents in upstate New York. He's constantly creating artworks in his head that never materialize. A few days in, he finds himself in a week-long internet bender, obsessed with uncovering a conspiracy about how the New York Times is secretly hiding messages in the graphic design elements of their online newspaper. After the bender, he goes on a digital detox, a hunting excursion, nudged by his father, who's worried about him not going outside. He kills a deer. As he's field dressing it, his migraine begins, and he ends up covered in deer's blood. His hometown later becomes a national news story when it's revealed that a local plastics plant has been dumping toxic chemicals in the water supply. The New York Times article published about it brings extra suspicion and confusion. He starts dissociating from reality into an immersive art piece, with everything taking on symbolic meaning. He takes art activism ever more seriously, wanting to change the real world through artistic actions, not just merely critique it. In the final act, after writing a manifesto, he concludes that the only way to sufficiently do this is through an artistic act of terrorism, as anything less would be just recuperated. He dresses up as Elmer Fudd and delivers a performance at the press conference about the poisoned water supply, in which the New York governor is scheduled to talk. Near the end of the performance, after forcing the governor to drink tainted water, he takes out a double-barreled shotgun and kills him. In the final scene, he drives to the church from his childhood. In the parking lot, he checks his phone. Among missed calls from his parents, a friend texted to say that the live stream was doing big numbers and that people had taken screenshots and made them into memes, dumb, low-tier ones about fingering girls and ketamine. The church is under construction. Tarps cover part of the ceiling, but he enters anyway, finds his regular pew from childhood, kneels, places his mouth on the pew in front of him, and tastes its familiar stain. So that's a plot of the novel. I'll get into the reading now. So we have a hero's journey, a hunting excursion where a deer is sacrificed, a plague of sorts with the poisoned water supply, and a ritualistic human sacrifice. Many general themes from myths. There's the same confusion detailed in the apocalyptic texts of the Bible. Is the poisoned water supply man-made or natural? The townspeople have been becoming ill for decades, their organs forming cancers, bringing chaos and confusion. Sacrificial resolution hasn't been feasible for some time, but since the 1960s, with the decline of Christianity, the breakdown in trust in institutions like the police and justice system, added with the rise of the internet and mediated communication technologies of today, there's a reemergence of both the potential for conflict resolution through the scapegoat mechanism and also reciprocal violence. During the hunting excursion, the narrator returns to his original external mediator, his father, by going on a hunt. It's interesting the act is something close to a contemporary version of sacrifice. We have a detailed scene where he dresses the deer in the woods, where he has the throbbing migraine and literally sees red, and also accidentally covers himself in blood. The blood making an appearance here is an important aspect of violence with its paradoxical qualities to stain or cleanse, contaminate or purify, drive men to fury, or restore them to life. Here, the blood is taken from the victim and applied onto the narrator to congeal, become contaminated. So why the governor? Why not kill someone from the plastics plant who actually is responsible? Well, the governor is a perfect scapegoat. He's an in-group member, relatively progressive, but has transgressed a group norm, and further fits Girard's definition of a scapegoat, and that the further one is from normal social status, the greater the risk of persecution. He's not a poor or lower class outsider or worker, but he's in the marginal group of an insider, the rich and powerful, in this case, a multimillionaire minor celebrity that is the governor of New York. The narrator claims to pick him as a target because of his artistically symbolic nature. He personifies corruption, the way the Elmer Fudd costume for him in the context of the artwork symbolizes his rural upbringing, his speech impediment, his short attention span. He's so thoroughly merged art and life that the governor, a human being, just becomes a symbol in an artwork to be destroyed. And this is the last sort of bit here. To his dismay, after he kills the governor, he witnesses memes being made just minutes after the deadly act that trivialize what happened. He realizes that even the terrorist act is already being subsumed to the semiotic regime of simulation. But what he doesn't foresee is that while in the instance, the memes seem to be diminishing the magnitude of what just happened, it could also possibly cause more violence to spiral out of control into the real world through dissemination of his manifesto, the live stream of the performance, the news articles, the possible copycat performances. Memes have this same feature of reciprocal action where they simultaneously provoke and suspend the escalation to different extremes. Here, we see sacrifice being turned into bits, into engaging content to be shared. As with the Dumas-Schell writing on economics, when compared to past economic systems like the gift economies of primitive societies, capitalism by nature produces alienation, which is in and of itself a regulator of violence. There's less violence between individuals with weak bonds and less chance for imitation. But I'd argue there's a threshold of alienation that once pushed past inevitably does lead to a kind of chaotic violence that we see in the novel. Girard proclaims in Battling to the End that the escalation to extremes reveals the power of God's divine intervention. And it's for this reason the church is where we may keep finding ourselves after we commit our ever evolving new forms of the corrupted sacred. Thanks.
Wow, fantastic. There's so much there. Oh, perfect timing. There's so much there. So much that we can unpack or inquire further into. Anyone want to jump in with a question, comment, extension of any kind? Scott, please.
So as I understand it, you wrote this before engaging with like Girard, just because there's so much, so much that aligns with Girard. It's very interesting how that, I guess this is maybe a testament to Girard's reading of novels that these forms reproduce themselves, but you didn't have any of this in mind when writing the novel then?
No, I didn't. I basically became interested in Girard through Geoff's writing. And I had wrote the novel I had just read Don DeLillo's White Noise, and then also Geoff's article about Baudrillard and 9/11 and simulation, which mentions Peter Thiel, but not Girard directly. But so this like final scene, I was like very influenced by Geoff's writing on this topic, but hadn't actually read any Girard at that point.
Excellent. Robert, please.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoy the talk. I'm curious how you see like art being able to actually change the world and have an influence, at least when not combined with violence. Like, how powerful do you see art as being able to affect actual change?
Yeah, I mean, I was writing this somewhat into response to sort of art movements that felt the need to sort of make every piece about politics. And it usually ends up being something didactic and dumb, like a protest sign, or they're these these kind of like moralizing gestures that don't really turn into anything. And so I wanted to kind of just like think about pushing, like applying politics to art in the most extreme sense and sort of see where that could actually lead. Because if you wanted to change the world, you'd have to do something relatively above and beyond. And so, I was kind of responding to the sort of art world movements that I was seeing, that I was trying to kind of push back against to see where it would actually lead. But
Interesting.
I guess I don't see, I sort of push back against, like, yes, most artwork is going to be political in some sense, but like the idea of changing the world through art, I actually think is a bad idea. So, yeah.
Sasha?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is particularly well organized, but there's something really interesting in your description of the novel about the way that the core character, or the narrator, as I guess you referred to him early on, because he is drawing so much of his motivation at any given instant from what seems to be like some subset of his social milieu, and he's so mimetic in his action that like artistic or distinctive or extreme behavior that might seem to be particularly romantic in Girardian terms ends up being redirected along these and combined into these social contexts, such that he unilaterally, it seems, engages in scapegoating and engages in these acts of sort of like rebellion or escape that are also typically normative to some degree in our modern alienated society. It just seems very interesting to me, this balance between the sort of novelty and seek for escape that characterizes the character and the way he seems to be embodied in or pulled into these trends or norms or I don't know, like rivers of activity.
Thanks, Sasha. And a final thought. Oh, sorry, Ryan, not to cut you off. Just let's get a final thought from Leif, please.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I wanted to just second your idea of, I'll be talking about a play later on, but I wanted to second your idea of art and its relationship to politics. I thought that was just so well said. And what I like about that is it's resisting it as total art is just, politics by other means. It's resisting that, but also resisting that art has nothing to do with politics also, and charting something of a neither nor. I just wondered if you could elaborate, if you had any other, maybe you don't, but if you have any further elaborations on that, because I'm just really fascinated by that.
Yeah. I mean, writing the novel was really me thinking through what I actually thought about politics and art. And I was in grad school at the time writing this novel about like a MFA grad student, and was sort of, I was making videos sort of about conspiracy theory, and was getting a lot of pushback from my professors because it wasn't clear what my political alliance was. They were too vague or too abstract for them to pin down they would ask me like literally, what are your political beliefs? And so it was kind of in response to that. And so yeah, I mean, I'm still figuring out what I think the relationship should be, and writing the novel was me trying to figure that out, but I'm still not sure. So,
Wow, excellent. That's a fascinating story there. Thank you so much for sharing, a look on the inside of your creative work. You're the first participant so far, Ryan, to share a reading from a novel. So that was really interesting to hear. And by the way, people listening or watching should go check out Ryan's website and learn more about his novel and his work. It's ryanmalady.com. And again, I'll put links to everyone's information in the show notes. Thanks so much, Ryan. Fascinating. And next up, let's hear from Connor Huff. So Connor is going to be speaking on René Girard's relationship to the Bible, and he'll be making some remarks on how René Girard's ideas fit in the context of biblical commentary. All right, so Connor, you can learn more about Connor if you'd like through Twitter. He's a little mysterious. He hasn't given us more information than that, but on Twitter, he's at Fitness Feelings with a Z. We'll put links in the show notes. Connor, please take it away.
Thanks, Justin. All right. René Girard's work on literature and the anthropology of religion show the Western world in the throes of the historical destiny set in motion by Christianity. The gospel text revealed the truth long hidden by archaic myth, the innocence of victims. This revelation, Girard argues, set history in motion, unfolding a new era which must grapple with the possibilities and dangers of that truth. This line of thinking is not typical of the modern era, and I venture the average person would be surprised by his arguments, just as I was. My initial reaction to his work was to think that the complete gospel revelation had finally been revealed, that Girard's work was, in some sense, a revelation of the revelation. At various points in his analysis, Girard himself gestures towards the originality of his interpretation, arguing that the most prominent biblical interpreters failed to do the text justice. Somewhat paradoxically, however, Girard views himself as a mere messenger, presenting a message which has been both revealed completely and understood. The latter part of his claim is the most intriguing and difficult to grasp. Interpreters of religious texts will always say their interpretation existed in the text all along. What they rarely do, however, is argue further that their interpretation is already universally understood. How do we address this, and how do we reconcile the seeming originality of Girard with his self-conception as an imitator? We should give strong credit to the evidence Girard brings to bear. Pointing to examples of historical persecution, such as witch trials or blaming Jews for the spread of plague, he argues that the message of Christianity must have been received because we immediately understand the innocence of these victims. No one thinks to suggest that empirical examination is needed to exonerate these accused. We intuitively separate fact from fiction when engaging with persecution narratives, grasping which parts are true and which represent the mythic attitude of the persecutors. This intuition reflects a deep internalization of the Gospels. Their message has taken hold below the threshold of thought. The more strongly the gospel revelation has taken hold, the less we seem to be aware of its impact. Girard is cognizant of this, observing how aspects of modern, secular, or postmodern projects are continuations of the Christian ethos of demystification and moral revolution, which nonetheless view themselves as transcending Christianity. They paradoxically establish their continuity with Christianity via their rejection of it, copying its structure but changing the content. Christianity serves as the scapegoat, the myth modernity reacts against. The Bible has become the target of the very process it began. In other words, lacking awareness of the truths we possess, we have become trapped in the structure of Christianity's original conflict with the world of myth, endlessly reliving the cycle of demystification. Here is the key point. This development has occurred because we understand the Gospels, but we do not understand that we understand. In other words, the gospel revelation was potent enough to change history, to reveal the inanity of the scapegoat mechanism, but insufficient to overcome the human proclivity for self-deception. We never allowed ourselves to openly acknowledge our understanding, to integrate it with human reason. It thus operated unconsciously, unchecked by reason's powers of distinction and contextualization. This failure to bring the gospel message into consciousness has sent modernity on a wild goose chase. We imagine that by ending difference and out-persecuting persecutors, that we can achieve a utopian world without openly acknowledging the most shameful gospel revelation, that violence belongs neither to scapegoat nor persecutors, it belongs to us all equally. Girard did not reveal the gospel message to history. He is right to acknowledge that work had already been done. Yet Girard achieves what may be the highest task of interpretation. He makes the text speak to rational consciousness with such force that it cannot be repressed. We can therefore view Girard's work as revealing the gospel message to human reason, a view which respects the uniqueness of his thought in the modern context, yet takes his self-understanding seriously. Earlier, I referred to the pre-Girardian understanding of the Gospels as unconscious. The operation of this stance is twofold: a deeply internalized belief in the innocence of victims, combined with a kind of clinging to the world of myth as a model rival. Hence the need to pathologically relive the original demystification, even in increasingly absurd forms. But after Girard, the gospel message has been raised to rational consciousness to the level of Freud's ego. We can finally let go of Christianity's original conflict and turn our attention to what the Gospels give as the essential post-mythical activity, achieving alignment with that absolute example of nonviolence, Christ. In a fitting reversal, reason rescues faith.
All right, excellent. That was a high octane talk. Awesome. I'm pumped up listening to that. So I would love to hear from anyone else who wants to maybe ask Connor some questions or advance some comments on that rather riveting discussion of Girard and the Bible or the gospel revelation. Scott?
This hones in on something that I've found kind of interesting, and I'm just to throw it out there and see if you have any thoughts on it. Like, you kind of put forth Girard as an important figure in the sense of like a turn in the rational conception of Christianity. Like, do you view him as like a kind of, I don't know if you're reading him from a Christian perspective, but like that would almost make him like kind of prophetic in a sense. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it's a really good question. And it's actually a question I kind of wanted to try to address, but there just was insufficient time to really investigate that. So I guess the honest answer is that I don't know, but that I think it's really important and sort of worth considering, as clearly there's a way in which Girard is correct in saying that we do all understand what the Gospels are saying already, and yet there is some kind of gap there. And I think whether he's kind of viewed as a sort of rational prophet or just someone who kind of, brings this tradition into a kind of scientific perspective or a kind of rational perspective, I'm not sure. But I just wanted to, I guess, say that I was thinking very much along those lines too.
Grant?
I guess I believe this question was kind of posed by another member earlier. I believe Jason was kind of like, okay, for those of you who like come to believe Girard's arguments, who like do not identify as Christians, like how do you kind of square that circle? Do you think that that's like a fair question given your thesis here and kind of what has been, did you have this kind of thesis that you laid out now coming into this, or is this something that like emerged throughout your study in the course?
I would say it emerged like throughout the course. Like I myself am not really Christian and also did not grow up with any context or like understanding of Christianity. So it was kind of like all new to me, if that makes sense. But I will say that as a part of like, I guess, going through the readings and talking to people, like I began to understand, I guess, both more the importance of Christianity and also the importance of Girard's ability to make the message of Christianity so relevant to our time.
Excellent. Sasha?
Yeah, I guess so. So Girard basically argues, at least as I understood it, that that the Christian revelation is like a meme that then needs its slow time to travel through society and sink into the collective consciousness. Is that your impression as well, essentially, about like it seems that Girard has this revelation about how to read the revelation that insists that it's a personal discovery and that needs to be picked up by other people. Do you see it spreading in a similar manner, or How do you feel society will grapple with that?
I honestly don't know. And I think it's a really interesting question because, I mean, just sort of the potency of the original Christian revelation. I mean, just this idea of how powerful revelation can be speaks to perhaps, a maybe not of comparable strength, but that Girard's thought may have a lot of importance as well, just in the sense that he is bringing, in some sense, issues that were kind of unconscious for us into our kind of rational social consciousness. So I think it's a really important question. And I think he might have a very significant impact, making this knowledge more accessible to like human reason.
Kevin, please.
Yeah, Connor, that was excellent. And so much for the canard that faith can't be taught, it has to be caught. What is the spiritual takeaway that you derived from Girard that you can apply to your own life?
Well, honestly, I would say my takeaway is in some way, I don't know if people here are familiar with Thomas Merton, who's a very famous Trappist monk, and he wrote a lot about just like the sort of quality and of the spiritual experience. I suppose my takeaway would be something like, we spend in the modern world a lot of time trying to like technocratically fix and optimize things when there's almost a kind of Zen quality, I think, to my takeaway from Girard, which is that he in some sense suggests that the rational thing to do is to not become obsessed with rationality and move towards developing. I understand his idea of mediating Christ. I think that has to be a kind of spiritual experience, which is in some sense like beyond language, beyond reason, beyond our ability to systematize it.
All right, excellent. Connor, once again, thanks for such thoughtful remarks and stimulating, such good discussion. So we can circle back to some of these themes at the end. And next up, I would love to hear from Wayne Shia. Wayne is a military historian, and he'll be talking today about Clausewitz in the context of the Cold War and 9/11 and a few other related topics. So please, Wayne, take it away.
All right. So first off, I'm also a minor government bureaucrat. So just to make sure everyone realizes all these opinions are personally my own and are not official in any way, shape, or form. All right. Let me just. Okay. So in many ways, Girard's reading of Clausewitz runs counter to the orthodox American Cold War interpretation of war, embedded deeply in the American military establishment and represented in Girard's mind by Raymond Aron. This orthodox interpretation focuses on Clausewitz's dictum that war should have a rational political object, while Girard highlights how Clausewitz's ideas about reciprocal escalation are actually far more important. To use Girard's words, quote, once unbridled, the principle of reciprocity no longer plays the uncautious role it used to play. Do we not now destroy simply to destroy? Violence now seems deliberate, and the escalation to extremes is served by science and politics. I think in some ways, Girard proved strikingly prescient. The French edition of Achevé Clausewitz appeared in 2007, which, while post 9/11 was years before the collapse of Syria into civil war, the meteoric rise of ISIS into concrete statehood for a short period of time, the bloodletting at the Bataclan in the heart of French literary culture, the migrant-triggered political crisis in Europe, ISIS attacks in San Bernardino and Orlando, a chaotic political environment that helped lead to the election of Donald Trump. In 2016, Girard's fears of intercivilizational apocalypse seemed to be marching more and more forward to fulfillment. Even at the so-called tactical level, to use the appropriate argot, one sees Girardian mimesis in all these events. First-person shooter-style video game animations and ISIS propaganda videos, Punisher logos on the uniforms of the Iraqi forces fighting ISIS, or the global proliferation of a military aesthetic first associated with American Special Operations Forces. Some of this imitation has been largely pragmatic. For example, the Taliban's adoption of night vision devices and its creation of an elite red group analogous to both American and special operations forces. But as Girard foretold, there has also been a grisly mimesis and escalation in savagery. We have gone from online beheadings to setting pilots on fire, genocide, slave markets, collective rape, and the like, all chronicled on WhatsApp. And in the case of Eddie Gallagher, a war criminal whose acquittal also brought about the downfall of the Secretary of the Navy, that mimesis touched in a direct way the American military. But what actually happened as we rolled the tape forward? For all of ISIS's apocalyptic pretensions, it proved no match for American air power. Despite a minuscule commitment of American ground forces, American aircraft crushed ISIS in conjunction with small numbers of Iraqi and Syrian Kurdish forces. The practical mechanics of that air power in Mosul remains controversial for good reasons, and ISIS continues to lurk in the shadows. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi went from triumphant caliph to an object of Trump's gleeful mockery as an American military dog chased him into his final hideout. Trump then turned his grim gaze to the bête noire of my generation of American Iraq hands, the famed Qasem Soleimani, the cunning Iranian spy master who seemed to outmaneuver the United States government at every turn until a drone strike incinerated his car. Soleimani went from a master of social media, including a distinctive sartorial style, to a grim reminder of American power, as an image of his dismembered finger with its distinctive ring circulated around Twitter as proof of his demise. But did the apocalypse come? It did not. Iran's retaliatory missile strikes caused traumatic brain injuries on US military personnel taking cover in bunkers in an Iraqi airbase, but Trump declined to escalate. In fact, he sought to withdraw US forces from the larger region. He failed to complete that in northeast Syria, but he did successfully put in motion the chain events that have led to the complete US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which the successor seems to have no intent of arresting via a new escalation of American violence. My sense is that Girard believed that technology had made the world a, quote, global primitive village, subject to an apocalyptic escalation of violence. But while the Cold War might have seen broadcast media and ICBMs shrink distances and borders, it appears that the internet has in fact created fragmented subcommunities forming and reforming in an online space. The resulting feuds can be all too bloody, but I think Girard is in some sense too pessimistic about the prospects for a man-made apocalypse. In some circumstances, it should still be possible to extract vengeance and walk away, at the least in the short term, because cultural fragmentation can help inhibit the mimetic cycle. Nevertheless, I will close with what still seems to me to be an important cautionary warning on his part. Pandemics tell us something about human relations, which can now be reduced to what might be called global trade. Clausewitz glimpses this when he says that there are no differences in nature, only in degree between trade and war. It is no accident that terrorist attacks often take place in trains and planes. Terror is inherent to all reciprocity. Ancient archaic fears resurface today with new faces, but no sacrifice will save us from them. It is thus urgent to develop strategies to deal with this unpredictable violence that no institution today control. However, the strategies can no longer be military or political. A new ethic is required in this time of catastrophe. Catastrophe urgently has to be integrated into rational thought.
Fascinating, provocative talk there. Wayne, I would love to hear from anyone else who wants to, again, great timing. I'd love to hear from anyone else who wants to, develop any discussion around these fascinating themes related to the military, war, conflict. Robert?
Yeah, so I have a question about the reciprocal violence aspect. To what extent do you feel like an awareness of reciprocal violence is a deterrent to violence? Because it does seem like most of the countries or targets that the US selects now are really not capable, or we sort of know that they're not going to actually reciprocate in an all-out way. So I don't know, how does that sort of play into who's selected as a target?
I think that's a great question. I think Girard, for all his fears during the Cold War, arguably maybe didn't recognize that the fear of reciprocal violence is in fact what kept the United States and the Soviet Union from going to a direct confrontation, because people really did know that that would lead to apocalypse, and that a lot of these other conflicts are sort of asymmetrical. Where he's very insightful, though, is he realizes how terrorism is kind of a way of almost getting around that. So I think at the extreme upper end of violence, right? And if you want to be optimistic, you could say that something like that may prevent, for example, conflict between the United States and China, or at least overt military conflict. Where I think Girard is still really, really insightful, though, is that, of course, most actual violence in wars doesn't occur at that high level. And the problem is that the reciprocity has a tendency to escalate and a tendency to intensify, as opposed to people recognizing, well, maybe we don't want to go down this path, right? It actually encourages people to go down that path.
Sasha.
Yeah, sort of a very similar question or a follow-up. I mean, what struck me thinking about the Iran conflict example is the degree to which there isn't parity. These aren't twin brothers to a great degree with equal arms or equal capacities, and that allows one party to step back. I mean, do you agree with that as you know, part of why this didn't escalate, and if so, or if not, like, what do you think for the future of a world where, I guess, nuclear arms being the great example, there's this concern of arising to an equal parity among almost all players of deadly violence?
I think Iran, I think one way, for me, one irony maybe is that Donald Trump is such an ignoramus. He's so provincial in the way he could walk away. I think this was in my abstract. I didn't have time for it, but if Trump was more, let's say Trump had been something more committed to kind of a liberal universalist vision, that kind of demanded kind of a universalist, and actually Girard in other parts of that book, he cites people like Schmidt. I mean, he actually talks about this issue. But because Trump didn't buy into responsibility to protect and things like that, he just kind of wanted to punch Soleimani in the nose or actually kill him. And then he was able to kind of walk away. And so there's kind of, and I think someone wrote this. I mean, in a way you could say my talk is optimistic, in a way say it isn't, right? I mean, it depends. It's glass half full, glass half empty, that there is kind of this traditional vengeance thing that maybe is actually doesn't spiral out of control, but that still makes it pretty unpleasant. I mean, that's still so in that case, I think I would actually kind of make that argument. The nuclear taboo, I mean, if you have increasing proliferation, I mean, what happens if it breaks? I mean, that I think is maybe a big, what happens if the Pakistani state collapses and someone gets a hold of the device? But I guess we'll see. But still, I will point out, we just came back from the anniversary of Hiroshima. Nuclear weapons are kind of this odd box. They're kind of this weapon that's in some way profoundly unusable. That's one of the dilemmas surrounding them.
Fascinating. Grant, this will be the final comment, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, with your point about how maybe fragmentation is actually a way in which, sorry, I meant to have my camera on. How fragmentation is like actually potentially valuable for stopping large scale mimetic outbreaks. So like we have the persistent small scale retributions, and in some way it prevents like the mass outbreak. We had a similar parallel when we were discussing social media dynamics, being like, oh, there's always new outgroups, new in-groups and outgroups forming. There's like the casual demand for sacrifice, which continues, but this fragmentation prevents a kind of like coordinated mimetic conflict. Is that similar? Do you see a parallel there, or does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it is. And is this an optimistic take? Is a negative take? That made me think of a way of phrasing it this way. I would say the fragmentation is good if you're a citizen of the United States, which is still the world's greatest military power. It's really, really bad, though, if you're someone in Afghanistan just trying to live your life and you're stuck in between these kinds of extremist groups who have, who are kind of one-upping each other. And a lot of that is driven by the internet. It's driven by, well, they've shown you can cut someone's throat on the internet. Well, I'm going to set this Jordanian pilot on fire. And if you're not and honestly, Girard in that apocalyptic book, he talks about climate change, right? Which I'm not, I have kind of mixed feelings about that, but that feeds into it, this kind of the global South being subject to all these pressures, some of them environmental, some of them conflict driven by these kind of mimetic powers, because they're not in an environment where they're kind of where there's kind of a strong enough state to kind of ring fence from that. And I think that's a very grim and dark vision for big parts of the world that I think Americans just don't realize. Donald Trump can walk away. A lot of other people cannot. That's part of the dilemma that's going on here.
All right, excellent, Wayne. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful talk, and it's just really cool how you bring to bear a really unique career and angle on Girard. So that was a pleasure to listen to. And by the way, for people listening, that was Wayne Shia, and I should have mentioned Wayne writes a Substack at plaintivenumbers.substack.com. You can also connect with him on Twitter. Again, I'll put links to everyone's information in the show notes. All right, awesome. This is so fun. Let's just keep on going down the line. So next, I want to hear from Father Sorcia. So Father is a Byzantine Catholic monk, and his responsibilities include being the monastery economos. He helps run retreats, does spiritual direction and preaching, and he's mostly interested in the social doctrine of the church. So today, Father is going to be talking about the teachings of Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Francis, and how those teachings relate or do not relate to the work of René Girard. So, Father, please take it away.
Thanks very much. So, Girard establishes the communal nature of mob violence, the myth of scapegoating, the innocence of its victims, and how the Hebrew scriptures and the Gospels subvert and demystify the scapegoat mechanism. An area that's fascinated me for these past couple of weeks studying Girard is to what degree of culpability and responsibility do we bear for the communal violence and the scapegoating that occurs in the respective institutions and communities to which we belong. So the first question that I would pose is, do we bear any responsibility, especially if we are in fact blind to the scapegoating and therefore have no intentionality to cause violence against those who are scapegoated, namely the innocent, those who are on the margins? This is of course more difficult for Christian communities, not that it undermines Girard's theory, I don't believe, but rather exposes the apostasy of Christian communities whose witness in the world is often characterized not by salvific nonviolence, but by mimetic scapegoating violence. While scapegoating does still exist today, Girard highlights its complexity in our own age. Scapegoating still functions, but it functions in a more degenerative, exposed state, in an age where the myth of religion and the absurdity of innocent victimage has been exposed. Communal violence in our technological age descends into forms of violence, mad violence, for example, mutually assured destruction, as is the case in nuclear warfare, which pose questions not only for those regulatory systems that seek to limit reciprocal violence, for example, the UN, or at a more domestic and local level, the criminal justice system, but poses questions especially for Christian communities. So what of Christian communities and their participation in violence, especially their participation in state violence, both locally and domestically, and internationally in wars between nations and tribes? In the 1980s, with the rise of liberation theology, Christian theologians and communities began to talk about social sin and about our participation in social sin. This resulted in Pope St. John Paul releasing an apostolic letter called Reconciliatio Penitentia, Reconciliation and Penance, in which he addressed social sin. That is, sin which operates primarily in the social sphere as opposed to interpersonal relationships. The Compendium on Social Doctrine of the Church says this as a summary of John Paul's thoughts. Sin is always an act of a person. This is because it is an act of free will of an individual, not properly speaking that of a group or a community. The character of social sin can unquestionably be ascribed to every sin, taking into account the fact that by virtue of human solidarity, which is a mysterious and intangible as is real and concrete. Each individual sin in some way affects others. It is not, however, legitimate or acceptable to understand social sin in a way that more or less leads to a weakening or virtual cancelling of the personal component by omitting only social guilt and responsibility. At the bottom of every situation of sin, there is always the individual who sins. So we see Pope St. John Paul held that every sin has personal agency, even as it operates in its very complex economic, legislative, and socio-political manifestations. Last year, Pope Francis issued an encyclical titled Fratelli Tutti, which is a summary of the themes of his social thought of his pontificate. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis highlights the importance of the recovery of truth in war and the need to cultivate a penitential memory. That is a constant repentance and awareness of the sins that our communities have engaged in by initiating processes for the recovery of truth, for the recovery of the things that happen in war. So if we apply the hermeneutic of continuity between John Paul II and Pope Francis, which holds the continuity as opposed to a rupture in sacred tradition between the teachings of various popes, various church fathers and councils, and I'll finish here in the next 40 seconds. Fratelli Tutti gives us a key to understand John Paul's thought. If we take personal responsibility for the sins of our community, not by some trite confession that we are all guilty, but by a meaningful penitential memory, we can omit our personal agency in communal violence and in scapegoating. The convergence of Girardian thought with papal teaching concerning social sin concerns the communal nature of mob violence, which scapegoats the most vulnerable and innocent. In conclusion, the convergence poses a liturgical question. How do we repent for social sin like war and scapegoating in its complex manifestations today? Consider how American Christians are responsible for the scapegoating of Julian Assange or Daniel Hale, who was sentenced last week, those who expose the truth of our communal violence and our violence against the innocent and then are marginalized for doing so. So the cultivation of a penitential memory, as Pope Francis suggests, I think offers a way for us to consider in our own current crisis of mimetic communal violence. I propose not only a truth recovery process as the basis for a justice system, but a penitential rite within a liturgical context, either in the sacrament of confession or repentance, or within another liturgical service. I'll stop there. Apologies. Over.
All right, fascinating. This seminar has brought to bear so many different perspectives and walks of life. This has been quite something to listen to. This is fantastic. So I see some hands up from, let's start with Kevin, please.
Yes, Father, that was great. I do have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you draw the line when it comes to collective guilt?
It's so, for example, when we consider, the case of war, and let's say a particular instance like the dropping of the atomic bomb or a grave injustice, like a slaughter of like 14 innocent people or 9 innocent people in war. It's very obviously we can ascribe guilt, right, to those actors, to those agents, to the personal agents of sin, right, like the combatants. But I really want to say stop, and I think Girardian thought and just the communal nature of mob violence, it invites us to consider the deeper meaning of guilt. Yes, was the person who set off a bomb guilty? Is the person who dropped a bomb guilty? Is the scientist who developed it guilty? Yes. But what about trying to choose an appropriate example for this room? Not that, I don't know how many of you grew up in a war zone, but like, does running off to college and university, do we escape our guilt? We're innocent. I'm just an academic. I went and studied. I think there is a real guilt that those who are not combatants in war or who put themselves forward for public office that we are also guilty of, and I think that's the invitation from Pope Francis. Does that answer the question, Jeannie?
Yeah, a little bit. What I can relate to is my parents' generation, WW2, they didn't want to question Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
No.
And, you know, to me, as a Catholic, those were clearly war crimes. So what is their responsibility, given that they were war weary, had been in either the Pacific or Europe and saw unbelievable atrocities? What is the level of their guilt, I guess, is the question. And what is my guilt in that?
It's an awesome question. I'm going to recommend we don't try to answer it today. But it was a good start that we've made on it. So thank you for that. Let's hear from Wayne. I'm sure Wayne has an interesting angle on this.
Yeah, I'm curious could you talk more about what you mean by truth? And the reason I'm asking this is because I was a political officer in Iraq, worked with the UN mission there, and they were my area was a mixed area, and there was clearly some ethnic cleansing that had happened under Saddam. And UNAMI had a historian by the name of Peter Bartu, and his job was to figure out in a very technocratic way what there were these redrawing of district and administrative boundaries. He's trying to figure out which of these redrawings were kind of completely legitimate technocratic bureaucratic movements, right? Rationalization, and which were clearly we're trying to physically move people around and manipulate the demographics on the ground. And I think the idea was that they would present this to the Iraqis and they would say, yeah, now we understand. And of course it didn't work, right? So, so for me, that truth obviously doesn't. So I assume you're talking about a different truth, but I'm kind of curious what that truth might look like and how might that actually look on the ground in terms of these issues of reconciliation.
Yeah, I guess in a much broader and general sense, we've covered and went into conspiracy theories, which I think, intersects with Girardian thought, in a real poignant way. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist or crazy one, because I think it gives too much weight to intelligence agencies and bestows an intelligence which actually isn't present. But the reality of war is the truth of what happens in war and the reasons why we go to war and what actually occurs in war. That's the truth that I'm talking about. The situation I'm most familiar with is the war in Ireland, referred to as oftentimes as the Troubles. It's now very evident that the intelligence agencies were running the IRA, certainly from the 1980s onwards. They were running loyalist paramilitaries from the late 70s onwards. So you had a war for 20 years, which in effect was controlled by and run by the intelligence agencies. So I think that the truth of war completely pacifies the ethnocentric kind of militaristic rationale for going to war. I guess that's the truth that I'm referring to. The kind of the more overarching themes.
Okay.
That justify violence.
Fascinating. Sasha and Leif, would you hate me if I had to play the time card just to keep things moving a little bit? Thank you. Thanks for your interest. I hate to cut. This will be the first time I have to cut the discussion short a little bit just to stay on track. We're already going to run a little bit over, I think. I don't want to run.
Stick your questions, comments in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. Type out your questions in the chat. If people are sticking around a little late, we can have time to circle back to some of these things. I just want to keep things going a little swiftly, so everyone gets plenty of time and doesn't feel like their talks are rushed at the end. So, man, this is so cool. This is like so wild. It's like, have you ever hear the one about the military officer walks into a bar with a Byzantine monk? No, you haven't ever heard that one, because this is the first time it's ever happened. All right, awesome. Let's carry on then. So, all right, just a couple more talks to listen to. I would love now to hear from Scott Litz. Scott is a writer and a musician from New York. He is very interested in Baudrillard, Bataille, Bourdieu, probably other French thinkers whose name starts with a B, or in this case, starts with a G. And yeah, Scott's all over the place. He's interested in aesthetics, pedagogy, Heidegger, post-colonialism. And you can find out more about Scott's work at violence.cafe. And in today's session, Scott is going to be talking about Girard and Christianity and much more. So please, Scott, take it away.
Okay, so I ended up veering a little in a different direction, but I think it's more interesting and kind of hones in on something that is recognizable and kind of brings together a couple particularly relevant concepts that Girard kind of goes into. So I titled this The Scapegoat Mechanism and Cultural Egalitarianism, which I think is kind of self-explanatory, but anyway. Technological developments have provided the means of cultural production and distribution to the masses. The barriers to entry into fields of cultural production that previously existed can now be reasonably bypassed, or in some cases have ceased to exist. The capacity to create and distribute technologically competitive art is essentially freely available, which causes an increase in potential rivals in a given field of cultural production. Simultaneously, social media has proliferated and increased visibility of the many newly competitive cultural producers. This is the other side of the accessibility of this kind of distribution. In Girardian terms, net mimetic desire increases alongside the number of what we might call potential consummated rivalries, or rivalries that one is sufficiently aware of to incur mimetic desire. The combination of intensified mimetic rivalries in the cultural field and functionally unlimited-ish access to the means of cultural production force the artist or the creator to more directly and often more anxiously confront their own output and status against their many peers and rivals. As a result, an individual who feels dissatisfaction or this anxiety toward their own creative or artistic impotence or output may turn to scapegoating mechanisms to shift responsibility from themselves and their own perceived lack of quality or their undesirable status in their cultural field. This, I think, is ostensibly why we see blame shift to increasingly broad and amorphous structural barriers, and in some cases like ludicrous kind of specters, like something like ableist privilege or something like that, something that's like very marginal and seemingly inconsequential. And though these barriers may nominally exist, their alleged pervasiveness makes them convenient and accessible, and therefore appealing alternatives to the much more difficult task of confronting one's own perceived failures. When faced with inadequacies or incompetencies or undesirable status within a cultural field that one has invested time and creative energy, which often entails vulnerability, such scapegoating can be leveraged as a kind of rationalization that shifts the blame off oneself and onto forces that are beyond one's control. Though this form of scapegoating has likely always existed as a recourse for excusing one's own failures, the barriers to entry had previously been much more palpable and numerous. Technology, time, educational resources, and material constraints all served as barriers that could be easily understood as insurmountable or beyond one's control, and thus act as an effective palliative for one's own cultural status anxieties. Essentially, many potential players couldn't even gain access to the arena prior to this kind of new phenomenon. Likewise, the increased mimetic desires and rivalries of the internet era exacerbate these anxieties in previously unimaginable ways. With the newfound abundance of the means of cultural production and distribution, it's now more often the case that the creator cannot as easily justify their undesirable status in a cultural field or hierarchy as they previously could. The barriers to entry are lowered or removed, and they can only confront their ability or inability to create and engage with their culture, which is a much more visceral confrontation than structural obstacles, real or invented, over which they themselves have little control or leverage. As a result, new external barriers to entry are invented or imagined to recreate this palliative effect, while persisting or pre-existing barriers to entry are magnified or exaggerated to defer responsibility or acknowledgement of naturally occurring stratification in a given cultural field. And I don't have much time to go into this, but this kind of consummates in this cyclical sacrifice of victims that are offered via these justifications, these kind of like amorphous new invented barriers or you know, things that stop other people from really, or stop other people from really like succeeding in a sense. people are offered to continually reify these otherwise amorphous barriers, and entire fields of production and related institutions are being reshaped, as we see and are obviously, I think at this point, all very aware of. So what can you do in this situation? What I came up with is essentially, first, and maybe most importantly, one can take responsibility for one's own work and recognize the desire to create scapegoats as an avoidance mechanism and as a means of deferring responsibility that's ultimately unproductive and a form of procrastination, essentially. Two, find a niche for one's work that reduces the potential of these consummated mimetic rivalries to a manageable number. So essentially, don't compare yourself to everyone, compare yourself to a manageable number of people who are worth comparing yourself to. 2.5, to go off of that, build organic connections with communities associated with or within this narrowed cultural field to humanize or concretize potential mimetic rivalries into productive, collaborative relationships. And then 3, distill the pursuit of one's own work to a goal that transcends, if possible, mimetic rivalries and positions you and your peers as working towards a common goal, whether it be some abstract good such as a specific knowledge, or aesthetic or artistic pursuits, or a political or religious goal that is sufficient to supplant what could be seen as comparably petty mimetic rivalries. And yeah, that's essentially it.
All right, fantastic. I especially appreciate the precise closing points that you leave us with. So I would love to hear from anyone who has any thoughts on Scott's talk, comments, questions. Sure, Grant.
Scott, I'm interested in the point you made at the end about how we may be able to avoid conflict by somehow unifying towards a similar end. As far as like collaborations, like how can you tell me a bit more about your idea of that? Like I have this book on my desk called Collaborative Circles, which is kind of which focuses on some of these kinds of partnerships, but I'm just curious as to like how you sort of think about that.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think when you view competition in this really abstract sense or rivalries, it can obviously be very overwhelming because you don't really recognize like the human aspects of it. So I think obviously kind of preventing or shielding yourself from like overload of this kind of exposure is important in this sense. But then I think there's like this, you can kind of reproduce this like these principles of the gift economy by collaborating with people in a sense that like you're working together and you have a working relationship in a way that's not like an economic thing, and you're kind of like, you know, giving each other feedback and stuff like that, and it just makes everything much more like concrete in a way that and I think that helps to further like dig out your niche. So you're once you recognize like a niche, you become much more like grounded in your work and the work of people you're with, and you kind of are much more easily able to conceptualize yourself and not just get like, you know, thrown away into the whole mimetic rivalry thing.
Okay, fascinating. Robert?
Yeah, that was a good talk. I'm trying to figure out like exactly what my question is, but it seems like what you're saying or what you're noticing is like it used to be like the means of production of artistic or cultural stuff like movies or whatever, or the means of distribution were scarce and hard and expensive. But now it's like anyone can create things, and you have the internet as a distribution mechanism, but the thing that's scarce now or is hard to get is attention and like hard to break through. And so artists are sort of faced with this thing of like, if they're failing, they can't blame the old structure. They have to just blame that like they're not interesting. They haven't broken through because they're not talented. But sometimes people are talented and just like they still don't break through. I'm wondering like how you think about that, or like when I don't think envy is ever really justified, but like what is somebody to do in the face of like, you know, the unrecognized artist that actually is good.
Yeah, I think that's 100% a phenomenon that occurs, and I guess I'm speaking kind of broadly to a phenomenon that is like recognizable, but not by any means like comprehensive and complete. I think it's just like a factor. And yeah, of course, there are legitimately interesting people that, you know, are doing cool stuff, and they can't either market themselves properly and stuff like that. So I think that's why community building is an important aspect of that, because you meet similarly, you know, people in the same field or working within the same thing, or kind of just give you a relationship that like justifies your own work, kind of. So rather than, you know, exploding into mass popularity, you kind of have something to sustain you of people who are, you know, respectful of your work and you respect their work, and you kind of understand each other. So I think that's maybe a direction to go in that. But yeah, I mean, there's a large like marketing component to this, obviously, which is, you know, part of the problem.
Yeah, excellent. All right, I would feel bad skipping a Leif again, so please, Leif, this will be the final one. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Justin. This might kind of be neither here nor there, Scott. So if you feel like it is, just discard it. But, you know, I was interested if you might have any thoughts on how what you just said relates to these discussions and debates about monoculture versus the non-monoculture, whatever that happens to be, and how, you know, maybe there is a period, you know, pre-internet or 20 plus years ago where there was this sort of monoculture, and you know, that some may characterize as having certain race and gender considerations only, and then others have characterized it in other terms. And there's been interesting things written in sort of favor and disfavor of that versus where we are now. And if you just had any thoughts about how what you've said relates to this discussion of non-monoculture.
Yeah, the monoculture question's interesting because obviously, I mean, my kind of take on the monoculture of like the 60s, maybe up to the 90s, is that it's obviously very artificial. It was like everyone tuned into one kind of stream of culture, and, you know, you could never have another Led Zeppelin, you can never have another Beatles. Like, it's just not going to happen again. It was like a very unique moment in media technology, and you know, so I think obviously it was appealing to sentiments of the time, and, you know, of course, prejudices and stuff that played into that. And that's why I say these cultural barriers, or the barriers to entries that people cite, it's not that they don't exist. It's that it's convenient to magnify things in, you know, any given situation, because it is a painful process to have to face, oh no, I'm not, you know, making any progress, or people don't like my work or something like that. So it's not that these barriers don't exist. It's that it's always going to be a possibility to kind of recourse back to them and say, oh, well, here is the, you know, and I think we're seeing that like exploding, and it's just like a phenomenon that is taking place as a result of this flooding of the market. It kind of like skirts the overproduction of the elites type thing, where, you know, there's so much of the same stuff being put out there that you kind of need to go back and try to figure out a way around that, you know.
All right, awesome, thoughtful answer, Scott. Thanks for your remarks. Very much appreciate them. Now, I would love to hear from Robert Carter. So Robert Carter is a filmmaker and a screenwriter. He makes satirical comedies in particular. He writes occasionally on his blog, and he's also into programming and crypto. He is going to be talking today about Girard in relation to The Last Psychiatrist, a pretty widely read blog by an anonymous social critic. So yeah, you can learn more about Robert at his website, which is robertbrucecarter.com. And Robert, please take it away. I'm super curious to hear your takes on Girard and The Last Psychiatrist.
Great. So I could talk like for an hour about this, but I'll obviously keep it to 5 minutes. For people who don't know, The Last Psychiatrist, or TLP, as I'll just say, he was this anonymous social theorist who wrote up until 2014, when I think he may have gotten doxxed. I didn't really look into it, but he basically disappeared. But he wrote on like a wide range of issues, but his main thematic focus was the idea of narcissism in America, and especially how it was like influenced by media and advertising. And so he sort of became obsessed with this idea of narcissism as people who create and maintain their identities, these false identities that are often copied from other people, like TV characters, and often will go to violent lengths to actually enforce those identities or preserve them. So I actually made a movie sort of about this, and then discovering Girard and like the stuff that he had to say, I think related was really actually illuminating. So the way it connects to Girard is that, it's fascinating that TLP, when he talks about sort of like paragon of the narcissist, he points to Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And of course, Girard is also a big fan of Notes from Underground and points to it as like the paragon of this example of mimetic desire. So they're both like looking at the same thing, but calling it different names. And, in the novel, the underground man is imitating desires of people he meets, and then he finds himself like locked in this mimetic rivalry with them, and ends up being envious and jealous and full of impotent hatred. I did a little digging on Girard and his like ideas on narcissism, and it turns out he wrote this essay about Freud, his theory of narcissism, which is actually a little different than TLP's, but I think for the purposes of this, it's close enough. And basically, Girard is like, he has a sentence where he says like, yeah, narcissism is like one of the most questionable ideas in all of psychoanalysis, which is like pretty funny that he was just so outright an opponent of it. And he says that like, no, actually, if we look at like Remembrance of Things Past by Proust, what we can see is going on is like, it's not narcissism, it's actually this mimetic desire. And like what people are, the quote unquote narcissist desires is from other people, is this sort of sense of blissful autonomy that certain people have. And that like, we're a mess and anxious and face these existential issues on the inside, and so then we see other people who have this blissful autonomy, and we desire to possess that as well. In TLP, basically the same thing comes up when he talks about people imitating TV characters, and he has this whole post about how somebody like wants to be Don Draper, and he's like, why do you want to be Don Draper? He's an alcoholic and terminally unhappy, and like the actual reason that you want to be like Don Draper is because or Tony Soprano is like, he's a TV character and he has this like script to follow, and there's like all this certainty in his life. He doesn't have to like choose anything. I think really TLP, he says that like the issue with narcissists is that they like copy their identities from other people. And I think what Girard would say is like, actually the issue is that or he would say like, we all copy from other people. The issue is not like the fact that you are copying or imitating others, it's like who you're imitating. And at one point TLP, he's like kind of struggling to like give advice to people, perspective or people who want to get out of this sort of narcissistic trap. And he'll say like, oh, maybe you should like read the classics. And he even admits that it's like kind of cringe advice, or, because like, but he says like, basically you're probably better off if you read like old books and like watch less TV. And I think he's actually getting at a very Girardian point, which is like, the imitation is inescapable. So what you should do is like imitate, people from antiquity or something like that. And of course, Girard points out that like a few hundred years ago, he wrote this essay, Innovation and Repetition, and he says like a few hundred years ago, people were expected basically to copy, the great religious or virtuous philosophers of the past. So I think it's not really about the classics per se, or necessarily Western canon, but it's about this idea of to get out of yourself or get out of your own narcissism. It's like copying it, it's like finding external mediators and finding role models or examples that are so far above you that you can avoid the trap of the underground man and not get sucked into this thing. To sum it up, I would say that TLP would say you get to choose who you are every day, and that your actions define you. And I think that maybe Girard would say that you get to choose who you imitate every day and who you imitate. will end up defining you. So either way, you should choose wisely. So, thank you.
Excellent. Fascinating connections there. And I appreciate the helpful exhortation at the end. Comments, questions? Anyone want to chime in from any angle here? Don't be shy. I mean, something I'll throw in just, oh, yeah, go ahead, Geoff.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, I'm glad you highlighted this, which we didn't really discuss in the course at length, but Girard's critique of the concept of narcissism, which I think is, it's quite I do recommend people read that. There's a section on it in Things Hidden. And there's also a book I'd recommend called The Selfishness of Others by Kristen Dombeck, which is a sort of, very clearly drawing on the Girardian critique of this concept. So, I think that I found this one of his arguments that's like most challenging and difficult to sort of accept on some level. I've been interested in this idea that there's some need to believe that there is something we can call narcissism. And so I'm just glad you brought that up. And I would recommend, if people are interested in this, check out this book called The Selfishness of Others, which is a sort of prolonged engagement with this whole dimension of Girard's thought. So.
Yeah, something I'll throw in real quick on the point about narcissism. I think you're onto something, Robert, because a little anecdote here is I once met the editor-in-chief of Psychology Today, and I was picking her brain, and one of the questions I asked her was, are there particular topics on the magazine, on the blog, that get notably more traffic than other topics? And she immediately had an answer, and she said emphatically, oh, narcissism, far and away, narcissism. And, Psychology Today, they have so many different authors who write about a bunch of different things. Just point blank right away, she said narcissism. And it really struck me how clear and direct and immediate she had an answer on the most popular topics. And it stuck with me. And then I started seeing it everywhere. I started realizing that actually people are obsessed with the concept of narcissism. Like, whether you think it's a real concept or not clinically, is kind of beside the point. There, even if it is, there's a clear kind of mimetic premium, if you will, on narcissism. Like something I later encountered was the subreddit called Raised by Narcissists. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's quite an interesting little sociology. People should go check out Raised by Narcissists, and it's because it's huge. And it's like basically just people who have been like hurt or harmed by their parents, and from small ways to big ways. Some people have, terrible parents, and so I'm not belittling them, but some people also just like have kind of, pretty common average amounts of conflict with their parents. But this subreddit pretty much like trains everyone to kind of diagnose their parents as narcissists, and they have this like whole arcane vocabulary for like what to do with your narcissistic parents, up to and including like disowning your family completely and going what they call no contact, which is just like literally refusing to talk with them because they're narcissists. So it's just a kind of interesting. I think you're onto something, Robert, with narcissism maybe being a kind of inflated concept that's actually proxying for a kind of mimetic fixation. The concept itself being a kind of mimetic fixation, which is, I think, some data for your point, possibly, or there's something to be explored there.
Yeah, I think, there's definitely some phenomenon of like self-involved people or something that are just very selfish in a way that maybe narcissism isn't the right word, but like, hey, maybe probably a lot of those parents are bad parents. I don't know if narcissism is the right word for it or whatever. It is interesting. In an essay that Girard wrote about Freud's book, Narcissism, he actually says that Freud, because Freud is kind of like, there's this saying narcissism, but I, as Freud, am mature and I can rise above it, and I do not experience this thing because I'm just sort of like wiser or whatever. And Girard is like, no, actually, narcissism is like an obstacle that prevents you from seeing mimetic desire, which is like sort of another TLP theme of like, going to therapy or like psychoanalysis is basically a way of you like avoiding changing and like becoming a different person. So I don't know, it's like another interesting parallel, but I think you're right. Like there's something underneath it. Like the diagnosis of narcissism kind of always feels like, I don't know if like there's like people who have like stomach pains and digestion will get a diagnosis of like irritable bowel syndrome, and it's like the diagnosis is like you have this collection of symptoms, but we don't know the root cause or anything about it. And it's like, it feels like narcissism feels a little bit that way. It's like a label on something and certain behaviors or thoughts without like true like explanatory power, or like a sort of, there's no like protocol for like overcoming it, at least in the way that psychology treats it now.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your remarks, Robert. They're very insightful, and I think it's a really interesting, relevant kind of cross-cultural connection or parallel there. All right. And so last, but certainly not least, let's now hear from Leif Bergerud, Leif Erik Bergerud. Leif will be talking about a play that he's been working on for several years now. So this will be our second panelist to discuss some personal creative work that they've been working on. And so Leif is a doctoral student at Columbia University in the Religion and Culture department. He's a playwright and director with a new play coming out next year in February. He also does fitness training, and he's very interested in questions around identity, self-worth, and the future of academia. So Leif, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I want to start off by, before I get into the play discussion, by saying thank you to Geoff and to all of you and to Justin. And I want to say thank you to Justin, in particular for the work that you're doing with indie thinkers. I have a lot of admiration for this entire endeavor. As someone who's struggled with kind of leaving academia and what comes next. There's an article that, so I just have a lot of admiration for this whole project, and I think it's fascinating to see it develop. There's an article that I'm just going to post in the chat, which is published a couple of years ago by David Graeber in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was originally titled, The Bullshitization of the University. And then it was retitled, Are You in a BS Job? If so, you're not alone in academia. And so there's a lot in this, but one of the really interesting points is that he makes the case that in previous eras, one thing that improved the university is sort of having groups or organizations or other institutions outside of the university that sort of made the university better, or forced it to be better, forced it to be more innovative, more equal, more rigorous, just better. And so I think that, not only is indie thinkers beneficial in obvious ways, but I think going forward, it's one of the ways that if there's hope for the university to experience revitalization, I think sort of inadvertently, that's actually one of the ways. So anyway,
thank you so much.
Great on that. The play that I'm working on, and I've got a timer here, so I'll try to stick to it. I will stick to it. Is a play called Blowback. It's an original play it's for my dissertation, yeah, but it's by now much more beyond that and more important than that. It's going to premiere in Phoenix in February, and I'm trying to organize events around it. There's 2 photography exhibits, original photography exhibits that accompany it, one on the theme of abandon, the other on the theme of passage. And I'm trying to sort of organize symposia and conversations that'll go on at the same time. So in some ways, the play is like a gateway drug to these other things, so to say. It centers on 2 women. One is a former pastor. They're both in their mid-30s, and the other is a recently minted PhD. They're both leaving institutions. One's leaving the church, has left the church, and the other's leaving the university. So there's some obvious resonance there. And the reason I wanted to take this, one is Geoff is just such a really careful and dynamic thinker, and I want to be in that environment. I also want to be in the sort of realm of people that are thinking independently. But there's a lot of themes in the play that are clearly resonant to Girard that I didn't know about Girard when I was cooking this stuff up. And so just to cite one, sacrifice, along with, I could talk about apocalypse and calamity, but the theme of sacrifice is a very important one in it. The play is in part drawing from actual historical events that happened near where I grew up, and near where my grandmother's farm was, which was the last hanging in the state of North Dakota's history, happened in 1931. It was white on white. In other words, the victim was white, and the mob of citizens that did it was predominant. We were, there's no way to know all the identities, but was pretty much assured that that was white. It was done by a group of 80 people in the middle of the night, broke this person out of jail who was a confessed murderer, and hanged this person off the bridge. And nothing was ever spoken of it. Again, that happened in 1931. So the play draws off of that in part, but there's a second hanging. This is a fictional one that happens in the contemporary time period in the current day, and that leverages the memory of the second one and turns this pastor into a scapegoat on behalf of the congregation. She encourages someone to join the congregation, who then murders 3 of the council members in a ritualistic fashion. And then she's sort of brought up about, did you know about his plans? Were you in some way complicit? And then it takes off from there. The last thing I would say about it, since I'm coming up on the time, is that as dark as it might sound, the real overarching question is, how do you move on from dead ends and from traumas? And so it's really a question about, how do you do that? And in case of both the main characters, that's in some way or another, it means different things to both of them, but in some way or another it means leaving institutions, and then also grappling with, when you've been really formed by institutions, how do you leave and also be honest about the influence that that's had? So hopefully I can mention more about this as the time comes close. And I'd invite you all to Phoenix. I have hotel discounts and all the rest. I mean that with a little bit of humor, but I mean it totally seriously too. So this has been a pleasure, and that's about 5 minutes right there.
Excellent, Leif. Thank you so much for your talk, and of course, thanks for the kind words. Anyone have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions provoked by that? Anyone? Yeah, sure. Sasha, please.
Sorry, this might be a hard one, but it came to mind, and I didn't have any sort of answer in my head. It sounds like your play circles around the concept of institutions, and the core association I have with that in Girard is this idea of differentiation, and this notion that institutions, structures, hierarchies are what differentiate society, and in some ways protects against the violence downstream from mimesis, but some degree of horizontal internal mimesis itself. How do you think of institutions, or do you in relation to Girard? Yeah, and sorry if you don't. Those just sort of occurred to me.
No, that's a great question. Thank you, Sasha. Yeah, the way that, so this sort of generated from this germ of this actual historical thing. I can remember talking to my grandmother 11, 12 years ago before I ever thought about doing this as a play. And so I started writing this, and I had to go through this last rewrite this summer, because the band that's going to be in the play, and the band that I was working with, ended up literally divorcing. So they're not going to make music. So I had this new period opened up. We're going to write for a different band, jazz band, actually, interestingly enough. But so I had this period open up, and I thought, I'm in this sort of one last rewrite. What can I do to improve it? And this is, so now I'm here. But so I want to differentiate between how I would think about it now and how it just sort of was bubbling up when I was coming up with it. But how I look at it now is that in the case of both of these characters, they're the way that they have to, who would know what will come in their 7th decade or something. But at least for where they're at now, their sort of existential vitality, if you want to call it that, or their kind of integrity, rests on the fact of having to leave or at least significantly distance. In both these cases, it's leave these institutions. They've both been incredibly formative to them. So there can't be a sense in which, I'm done with the university, I'm done with the church, and now there's no influence on me, or I completely wash my hands of it. So that's one of the struggles. So it may be like an interim period where they're away from it, and they'll somehow return to it. I don't have the full arc of their life, but how I would think about the institution, I mean, that's directly relevant to my own struggles with it. I don't really have an answer other than to say, I think it can be very scary to leave institutions in some ways, maybe the university most of all, because when you go into graduate school, there is in a way no plan B that's spoken of. The idea is if you're good enough, you'll just find a job, and anyone who doesn't do that is maybe, profiting from misinformation or whatever bullshit, So I think I don't have I'll say this, I've struggled with it. I don't have like a blanket answer, but I think it's important to be honest about it. And I do think, trying to find ways to exist outside of it, even if you have one foot still in it, is really vital. And I think there's a lot of forces that would criticize that, and there's a lot that would scare us away from that.
Excellent. And Scott, I think this will be the final comment or question, please.
Yeah, Sasha kind of asked, I was going to ask about institutions and your kind of opinion about them, but I think to go off of what you said, it seems interesting now that like exiting a certain institution, I guess specifically in this case, academia, or maybe most notably academia, is like used as a kind of jumping off point for a lot of people, and publicly separating from an institution. I mean, even like the New York Times, and people are either voluntarily leave or they are ousted from the New York Times or something like that. It's interesting how their association with an institution formerly then kind of gives them, especially if it's voluntary, I think, like I guess in Justin's case, where he voluntarily left and then put skin in the game, and then it becomes like this, oh wait, this is like a kind of like a power move that, then holds a lot of weight and then moves from there. So I guess, I mean, like I said, Sasha kind of answered the question, or asked the question, and you gave your thoughts on it. So if you have anything else to say on that, I'd be curious.
I mean, just as far as institutions, right? Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of thoughts on that. But I just think that, maybe one thing that I had a hard time being honest about for a while is how much fear is involved, and how much, what will it mean? How will my family look at me? How will my friends look at me? And that stuff is, not always easy to talk about, or even just to acknowledge privately. How will you justify going and spending money on graduate school or whatever it is, So I guess I would just say, I think there's a real personal, there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of a kind of angst, I guess, that's there, and trepidation for what to do when you're in that situation. I think, and I'm like naturally a more institutionally, leaning person. I think we need institutions. I think they need to be vital. I think they need to be healthy. I don't think we can have a world without them. But that said, I mean, when an institution has, corruptions, or is in a really declining, dire state, we need to be honest about that too, even as much as we need the thing.
All right, everyone. Well, that has been our 9 panelists. Folks, these were really impressive, extremely thoughtful talks. I'm very, very pleased, and yeah, just kind of inspired, and I have a lot of thoughts. I have been taking notes, and I'm quite prepared to say a few brief words just about the common themes and just kind of the overall ethos of the talks and what I've kind of taken from them as a whole. But I'd like to let Geoff speak first. I'm sure he has some thoughts, and then I'll give some just very brief remarks after Geoff.
Sure, I'll be brief and pretty general, but I have found sort of a through line that I think does bring together much of what's been said, and that is that there's a kind of paradox in Girard's work, which is that it takes the form of sort of systematic argumentation in order to persuade us of a particular set of claims about, certain truths or things hidden that his work is revealing to us in some sense. However, it's interesting to note that in terms of the sources that he credits with the insights that he's arrived at, which is a theme I've tried to emphasize. The way that he works with evidence is a theme that I've tried to emphasize in my lectures throughout the course. Often points not towards a kind of process, a sort of discursive process of rational argumentation, but instead towards, I'd say, two things. One is the capacity of art to bring about a kind of transformation, and to bring about a kind of perspectival shift, which is the original way that he characterizes what he calls conversion in his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, where conversion is really fundamentally a creative and artistic process rather than a primarily sort of rational one of persuasion. And so then later it centers on a subject that various people have discussed, which is revelation. And so obviously that has, I mean, so if we think of conversion and revelation, those are sort of, both religious terms, but they both seem to be ones that he sees coming about through these means that do not necessarily pass through rational argumentation. And so people might recognize, I'm thinking particularly of Connor's contribution here, where he thinks about, what exactly is the role of Girard's intellectual contribution vis-a-vis the revelation that he sort of sees himself, as Connor said, as a messenger of. So I think that, these themes and that there is a tension, I think, between the way that he understands his work as I've said in the past, scientific, right? And in that sense, he sees it as a body of work that is centered on the presentation and analysis of evidence that can be, to some extent, objectively assessed. And his interpretations can be measured against one's own assessment of the evidence that he presents, right? But then on the other hand, that a great deal of his work emphasizes a very different process by which our perspectives on the world might be transformed, right? And so I think this ties into a number of themes, but it's partly why I'm happy that a couple of these presentations dealt with works of art, right, that are exploring these themes, because I think for Girard that is really central to how we gain a deeper perspective on mimetic dynamics. But at the same time, I think it relates to this kind of tension between a sort of free will, right? A sort of notion of an individual as a sort of free agent possessing free will, as Father discussed as sort of one model, versus some kind of sense of collective or group agency, right? Because if we think about something like revelation or the impact of art, that's always occurring on a collective level, right, as well as an individual one. And so I think that this kind of tension in his work between these two sort of paths, right, is one that's kind of been reflected in all of the different perspectives we've heard today, right? And that I think, each of these contributions has sort of given me a different way of thinking about. And, I think it's a productive tension within Girard's work. And, it's the one that I have kept coming back to. And I was glad to see that also reflected in what people shared today. So I think I will wrap it up there, but I think this has been a really rich and fruitful discussion, and I hope people will continue thinking about the ideas that they brought here, and that we can look forward to, them appearing in different forms, written, performed, etc., in the future. So
yeah, absolutely.
And that you will continue undergoing these kinds of processes of transformation, which are maybe partly rational and partly kind of ineffable.
Yeah,
sort
totally.
of conversions. So I will leave it there and pass the baton to Justin.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks for those thoughtful discussant comments, and of course, big thanks to you, Jeff, for doing the lecturing in this course and facilitating the seminars. So I know this has been quite an endurance run, so I won't speak for very long at all. But I do just want to kind of comment on what I saw as one of the big through lines through the 9 talks that we listened to today. I promise I won't keep you too long, and I'll keep this to the point, but I do just want to make a quick contribution. So what I was struck by listening to the talks today, as someone who did not participate in the seminars, was a certain kind of visual kept popping in my mind, or a certain kind of mental model was continually being evoked in very different ways across the different talks that were given today. And to sketch what that is, I should probably start with kind of the conventional wisdom around Girard as I see it. I mean, I think the average person out there who's maybe heard of Girard, you know, the average bourgeois Philistine who, you know, maybe has some books on their shelf but doesn't really read them seriously. Maybe they're familiar with Girard a little bit, but they never really went deep. You know, the average Philistine would say something like, "Oh yeah, that guy René Girard, I get it. I get the idea. You know, desire is zero sum because people copy each other to get people get their desires from each other. So therefore, desire is intrinsically zero sum. This leads to status conflict and fighting over things that can't be divided, and this leads to conflict and war. And yeah, okay, I get it. That's pretty clever idea, Girard. But what's really, and then people, you know, if they're particularly sophisticated, they might add on, digital technology is just making this worse. I would say that this is kind of like the maybe a bit of a straw man, maybe a bit of a cartoon version, but not too far away from what most people have in their minds when they, you know, are vaguely familiar with Girard today and know a little bit about his ideas without really going too deeply into them. But listening to you all talk about Girard after studying Girard deeply for the past 8 weeks, what I was most struck by was how a lot of the problematic tendencies around mimetic rivalry or mimetic desire, which many people today have heard of, are not at all necessarily bad in any kind of universal way. But really what is crucial that you've made me realize listening to you all is how the goodness or the badness of the kind of Girardian psychological dynamics is highly contingent on what we might call the level or the nesting in which it takes place. So this was the kind of visual or metaphor that was continually being evoked in my mind by listening to all of you, was this idea of kind of nested models or nested systems and different kind of levels or thresholds where something that in one context is often bad suddenly becomes good when it's in a slightly different level of the nested systems, or when it exceeds or falls short of some threshold. What is good becomes bad. What is bad can become good based on highly sensitive conditions, which my mind kept wanting to think of as different levels or kind of nested systems and subsystems. And I just thought that was interesting. Like, so some examples, for instance, you know, like when Connor was talking about the kind of original demystification that the Christian revelation was, according to Girard. On one level, at one part of the system, it can be this profoundly liberating, emancipatory, kind of peace generating revelation. But at the moment it becomes unconscious and we start kind of madly reiterating or re-seeking the demystification dynamic, then all of a sudden it becomes this kind of wild, unconstrained, violent dynamic. That's just one example. But also, you know, listening to Wayne talk about Clausewitz and the continuum between trade and war, that really got me thinking, you know, in some ways, trade and war here are undifferentiated. Undifferentiation and differentiation was a word many people in today's session used. But then it got me thinking about, cryptocurrency and the kind of fundamental revolutionary break that, Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper represents as a technological innovation, where now possibly, who knows, but I'm inclined to think personally that we now have crossed this threshold where war is now fundamentally locked into trade, basically. And perhaps there is a threshold called cryptocurrency where trade and war are now, if they are indeed perhaps on a continuum, now they're locked into a trade only kind of cryptographically sealed system or subsystem, where now now they're kind of conflated, and war is contained because it's kind of entered into this new nesting. I'm kind of just riffing here. These are just kind of hypotheses and the ideas or models in my mind that were evoked. I don't know that I would defend any of these too aggressively, but these are the kinds of things that you all got me thinking about. Listening to Father talk about the question of bearing responsibility for scapegoating if we don't know. Again, that's a kind of a critical threshold of, the threshold of awareness and self-consciousness. If one is aware of what you're doing or not, this has a significant implication for thinking about what the thing is and what it really means and where responsibility is really distributed. Responsibility again appears in Scott's talk when he talks about the importance of taking responsibility for one's own work as possibly being a kind of crucial, a crucial kind of escape hatch, or a crucial kind of solution perhaps to some of these thorny, knotty problems. And then of course community. Scott hints at the possibility that community represents a kind of solution or an attractive kind of research agenda for solving these interminable mimetic conflicts. And, I think Robert speaks about this a little bit too. And of course, Leif speaks about this quite strongly in his own kind of personal terms, and even, kindly with reference to what we're doing here. And, without being too self-referential, I mean, I completely agree. And this is the kind of insight that does underwrite the indiethinkers.org community and the courses that we put on. So of course I'm flattered to hear you see that consistency. I definitely am coming to it with that kind of intention and that kind of hypothesis. So, but again, I see community as one of these kind of critical thresholds where what is bad out in the kind of unbounded digital global commons suddenly becomes good when it's able to be engineered and contained within a different type of subsystem with different conditions. And someone alluded to like the difference between the models that you pick, right? If you pick the right model and if you're embodying and following through on mimetic desire, but you have the right model, it's a good thing. If you have the wrong model, it's a bad thing. Again, just another kind of example of there's a lot of conditionality basically in the Girardian psychology and the Girardian philosophy. And it's just so much more nuanced, so much more conditional when things go bad or things go well, according to Girard's basic models. And I think most people don't appreciate that. And I think the 9 of you who gave talks today kind of showed that in many different interesting ways, but I saw that as kind of the commonality. So I should cut myself off. We've now done 2.5 hours. So I want to thank everyone for their patience and their endurance. Everyone out there listening or watching, thank you for checking out our work and what we've been up to. We're very, I'm very pleased and I'm very proud to share the culmination of the past 8 weeks in this course that Geoff Shullenberger has been facilitating. So I'm very proud to share with the world, everyone in the group, and what all of their research and thinking has amounted to. So this has been fantastic, really fun and rewarding for me, as I'm sure it has been for Geoff. So big thank you to all the panelists. Big thank you to everyone listening. Big thank you to Geoff for doing the course. And yeah, I'm humbled. I'm very, very proud, very pleased. And just thanks to everyone. Let's stay in touch, of course. And if anyone ever needs anything or I can help with anything, whether you're in the course or you're listening to this out in the world, just send me an email. We're doing a lot of things like this, and we plan on carrying on this mission further and further into the future. So please stay in touch, everyone. And I think that's all I got. All right, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.